Walaykum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim and I'm joined by my co-host Rafael. And alhamdulillah, we're joined by someone very special today. So Hassam Munir is our special guest today, and he is currently pursuing an MA in Mediterranean and Middle East history at the University of Toronto. He is a research fellow at Yaqeen Institute. He has experience in the fields of journalism and public history and was recognized as an emerging historian at the 2017 Heritage Toronto Awards. So Assalam.Walaykum Hassan, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Walaykum Assalam. Thank you so much for the invitation.
JazakAllah Khayr for coming on, accepting our invitation. And I actually, just doing some background research, I saw you were on, you've already done a few interviews, you're involved with Yaqeen Institute. So how's your experience been just doing all that sort of stuff when it comes to, putting your material out there? Even I've seen some blogs and articles that you've done as well.
Yeah, absolutely. My entire, reason for getting into the field of history has always been about just trying to make that knowledge more accessible, because there's, a lot of amazing research that's done at universities by independent researchers, even by some of the traditionally trained Islamic scholars around the world. But it never sort of reaches the public in a way that they can, easily engage with it and learn from it and find inspiration in it. So I just try to take information from some of these, thick, dusty books and libraries and these journal articles that people generally will not find or go looking for, and try to repackage that information and present it in a way that people are sort of, there's a shock value to it that, wow, is this also Islamic history? Is this also what Muslims have done or what Muslims have experienced? I think it makes for a much more thorough and a much more appreciated understanding of who we are as Muslims and what our tradition is all about.
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
Starting from the very beginning of Islamic history, and I know this is something that a lot of your research has gone into, the kind of spread of Islam and the nature of that. But one of the things that brought me to Islam was actually studying history. So I study history at University of Sydney, and
mashAllah,
I was really, if you saw my marks, you wouldn't be saying that. But
oh wow,
alhamdulillah, everything's going all right so far. But I suppose one of the things that brought me to Islam was my fascination with Islamic history. I remember when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I found this dusty old history textbook in the back of a library at school one day, and I just flicked through it because it's always been history's always been my passion and the thing I wanted to make a career out of. So I remember picking up this dusty old textbook, and it had in it the Islamic world to 1600, and I think I read that 10-page chapter about 150 times, and I just couldn't take my hands off it. It was the most fascinating thing I'd ever read. I obviously hadn't heard much about Islam growing up in a non-Muslim family in the West. Right. But picking up this textbook, I was kind of entranced by Islam, its symbols, and the early history and its the way it kind of burst forth this tiny isolated peninsula that had been of little interest to anyone for the Romans, the Persians. No one really cared about the Arabian Peninsula and especially the Hijaz. And then how it spread to become this empire of science and culture being very important as well. So for people who aren't really aware of the beginnings of Islam and how it spread from sort of, a very small group of Arab and Abyssinian followers in a very isolated part of the world to a kind of global religion that flourished from China all the way to the Pyrenees in France. How did that happen? And what were the sort of, what was the sort of breakdown of that transformation?
So that's obviously a very, very large, complex question that people, you could dedicate your entire life to studying it, and people have, and you only end up scratching the surface, right? There's many questions within that. You're right in that it was an incredible, transformation, I should say, at the global level. And But it was very much, the foundations were very much laid during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. And this is something we sometimes, fail to recognize in this larger question of Islamic history and the spread of Islam, etc., is that the principles and the values and the precedents that were set by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his followers around him have remained the consistently accessible source of inspiration for Muslims throughout history. So obviously in this question, we have many different questions about conquest and Muslims conquering certain areas of the world, Islam spreading to certain areas of the world through other sort of factors and mechanisms such as trade, such as migration, such as intermarriage, such as influential people in different societies converting to Islam and their followers sort of following them into Islam. So there's these many different factors, as well as the scientific production of the Muslims, inheriting all this knowledge from the pre-Islamic civilizations and developing it with the purpose of understanding the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then also sharing it further back with other civilizations. So, it's a very complex, there's so many angles that we can go on here on this question, but I think a key thing to keep in mind as a starting point is that it is the consistency of Islam that has been exceptional throughout history. A lot of movements start, a lot of developments happen, a lot of new ideas and ideologies emerge in history, but over time, as they spread to different places, they become very drawn out, they become stretched thin to the point that whatever connection, whatever original source they had that brought it together initially, it had become so different and so distant from that it's almost like you have different ideologies and it's a completely different thing. But Islam has always been Islam, and the Quran, obviously the authoritative source, the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the authoritative source, and the Islamic tradition so well organized right from the very beginning, the process through which Islamic knowledge was produced, that no matter where Islam went, whether it went to China, whether it went to South America, whether it went to Europe, whether it went to small islands in the Pacific at different points in history, Islam could be practiced keeping those core principles and those core practices of the tradition intact, while also taking whatever was acceptable in the local culture and local customs and bringing that into the way Islam was practiced. And I think that's part of the beauty of our history.
One of the points I kind of wanted to touch upon for was that is certainly been the case. I think probably from a later sort of time, a lot of people would argue that early Islamic history was actually quite fractured. You had the kind of not just theological differences. For example, you had like Mu'tazilis and Asharis, which actually became a very political difference during the time of the Mihna. But you also had the kind of insurrectionist Kharijis, you had the Shia movements, and then you had the kind of plethora of impious caliphs who didn't really seek to do anything except for advance their own position. So how does that sort of fit into the understanding that Islam was traditionally maintained? Because even people say that Mu'tazilites, like, if it didn't get backing from the government, then we would have all been Mu'tazilites. Well, from the Abbas, from Al-Ma'mun.
Yeah, so that's where the issue comes, is like, do we truly have that tradition intact, and are we really continuing that tradition that we see from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or was it kind of dictated by the governments or the powers of the time?
It's a point that can be argued, and I think there are some arguments, good arguments that could be made on many different perspectives and approaches to how we answer this question. My argument would be that there has still been that consistency relative to the way that other ideas, other worldviews, ways of understanding the world have spread throughout history. Within Islam, there has still been that consistency and still been that regular, consistent reference back to the original sources. So yes, there have been many different movements. There have been many different understandings, as there continue to be today. Many, accepted and many non-accepted differences of opinion. And I think it, once again, it speaks to the diversity that is possible within the Islamic tradition, and how sort of Islam can respond to different contexts and different situations without losing its essential reality. But at the same time, I would argue that consistency has remained. Yes, there were very pronounced sort of differences between people practicing Islam or claiming to practice Islam in different ways and different forms. And sometimes it is very clear when they seem to have really pushed the boundaries of what we can consider the Islamic tradition. But I would still argue that there has been this, I think, historically speaking, from a historical lens, the fact that even today, a Muslim from Siberia in Russia can travel and find a masjid in sub-Saharan Africa, in West Africa, and go inside the masjid, and they wouldn't need an introduction to what they have to do. The fact that they know that there are these certain things that they have to do, the fact that they know where to stand for the prayer, what is being recited, etc., all of these things. The fact that we can expect that to be a normative case, I think that itself is a very exceptional thing about the Islamic tradition within human history, because rarely, extremely rarely, and to be honest, I wouldn't find any comparable example of that level of shared, core principles, values, beliefs, and practices in any other worldview that has existed and spread so far in the world throughout Islam, throughout human history, I should say.
I would certainly agree with that, in the sense that Islam was maintained from a very, very early time in kind of this understanding of traditional knowledge and knowledge of the Sunnah, and that was transmitted through various teachers to other teachers who kept the tradition alive. And we still have preserved aspects of the early foundational texts of Islamic law, for example, that have been authentically transmitted, and we still use them as a source today. And I don't think that there are really, as you mentioned, any other major religious or cultural traditions that can claim that. But one of the points I really wanted to ask you about was how did religion inform the early conquests of the Muslim empires, particularly the one that first springs to mind, and it was probably the most significant, was the invasion and defeat of both the Byzantine Empire, so the Roman Byzantines in Syria, and the Persians, because everyone understands sort of that Muslims defeated the Persians and the Romans. It was always that prophecy with, I'm fairly sure Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that, the two great empires and powers of the time would be defeated by the Muslims, and people kind of laughed at that, but then eventually they did. But how did religion inform those movements? So some people would certainly claim that it was a kind of, Muslims were implored to go out militarily and expand the empire. Was that the case? Or was it more kind of, I've also heard people say that it just so happened that the Muslims became embroiled in conflicts with these two powers, and then consequently those two powers were defeated by Muslim armies, and hence Muslims occupied the lands.
So, one of the things I always like to, emphasize in my research, for most topics in Islamic history or history in general, is that we often seek very straightforward, sort of, simple answers to extremely complicated situations. If we take the life of one individual, whether today or 1,000 years ago, if I take my own life and why I make my decisions, how I make my decisions, how my decisions impact my environment, how my environment responds and impacts my further decisions, it's a very complicated process, regardless of what my stated purpose, what my stated inspiration might be, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Not to say that this isn't a question that needs to be discussed, but I think that's very important to keep in mind before we jump into that discussion. Now, you mentioned the two sort of primary, commonplace perspectives on this question. I think the latter one is more, the perspective which says that the Muslims became embroiled in the the political developments in the region. I think that one is just a bit more leaning towards the a reasonable interpretation of the sources we have available. Let me put it that way. But at the same time, there was this, this impetus, right? There are these ahadith from the Prophet ﷺ himself that predict these particular conquests of the Byzantines and the Sassanid Persians in particular, and also of Islam reaching particular places. So initially, I think the most reasonable explanation is that initially, during the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his early successors, what the idea was that the message of Islam had to be communicated, and in cases where there were limitations on the communication of that message, and part of the communication of that message was the political situation of the Muslims, because from the perspective of people in the Byzantine Empire, in the Sassanid Empire, they recognized this suddenly emerging threat just because of how fast Islam spread in the Arabian Peninsula itself, right? So for them, it was this serious threat. It wasn't the Muslims like, a fly sort of going and landing on their nose and them trying to like swat it away or something that initially caused these things, but they recognized Islam. And we have ahadith and narrations that, tell us to that effect as well, that they were concerned. And for example, when Abu Sufyan, before he embraces Islam, he goes to Syria on a trade mission, Heraclius, he actually, gives them a little interview about who is this person, Muhammad, and he's asking all of these questions because they need this information. So it wasn't a Muslim, insurgency into these empires that started these conflicts initially. There was this idea on on the side of the Muslims within the understanding and the worldview of the Muslims, and this was normative at the time, that they had to communicate this message and this worldview, and they had to brush aside some of the impediments, right? But at the same time, on the other side, there was this more political perspective on the situation, that this is an emerging sort of regional power and we have to respond to it. So oftentimes you find the Roman armies coming towards Arabia rather than the Muslims going towards Roman-controlled Sham first, right? So again, it becomes a very complicated situation once the Muslims have actually established their rule there. And even the conquest, the word conquest is very broad and very easy to use to explain very complex events again, but not all places were militarily conquered. Some places, the Muslim armies were actually welcomed by the local people because they were seen as liberators from more oppressive rulers who had ruled in that region before, right? And in some places, there were treaties made. There was no conflict. There were treaties made, and then the Muslims receded and went back, etc. So there were all these different types of scenarios that played out in different situations. Yes, there's no denying, and I think Muslims sometimes do go, overstep when it comes to denying that there was a military and there was a violent aspect to the conquest at times. But when you see, for example, one of my favorite examples is Business Insider, this online blog. They had this animation that they posted a few years ago on Facebook, which shows the spread of different religions. And they show when it comes to Islam, obviously quickly this little green splotch on the map emerges in, around the year 622. And then it just, explodes and spreads
and the whole
all
world
across
is green.
North Africa, Central Asia, everything, just everywhere all of a sudden. And I think the important thing to really recognize here is that the spread and the movement of Muslim armies can't be equated with the spread of Islam itself. Because the real question here is, many historians will recognize that yes, it was normative for one people to conquer another people, and for different particular localities, they'll be under one empire, then they'll be under another empire, and this was how the pre-modern world worked, right? But the real problematic question is that, well, were all those people then forced to convert to Islam at the point of the sword when those armies actually got there? And what these maps and these animations kind of mislead people into thinking is that just because the Muslim armies within 100 years had reached Spain and had reached the borders of China and all these places, you know, even at the time, in many places in Arabia, Islam hadn't been established in the sense that the majority of the population was Muslim, much less anywhere outside the Arabian Peninsula. And obviously that's a different question, you know, altogether, about how did Islam actually spread, the pace of it, the mechanisms and factors involved. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that yes, there were conquests. Yes, at times they were violent, at times they were non-violent, but the conquests themselves do not represent the spread of Islam or the imposition, the forced imposition of Islam onto any of the conquered peoples. And such conquests were normative at the time. And when we speak of them, we're speaking of them not in a prescriptive sense, not in the sense that Muslims today have to get up and replicate that situation, but as a historical phenomenon in a descriptive sense that yes, this happened, we're not going to deny it, and we're going to take the relative lessons that we can from it from a historical perspective.
Well, you mentioned that there's historians who have the opinion that by the nature of empires do expand. Like there were, I don't think you can ever name an empire in history that was content with its influence. It always wanted to grow its influence and grow its wealth and prestige of the dynasties that ruled it and so forth. I think someone asked me.
And sorry, one thing I'd just like to mention briefly about empires. I think another thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of anti-imperialism sentiment and anti-imperialism movements, etc. Nowadays, and many people, including myself and others, we've sort of learned in an environment where imperialism is thought to be a very bad thing. But again, from an intellectual perspective, we do have to ask questions about, speaking about the expansion of empires as this really horrible thing that occurred in history, and yet even today, we continue to live in a world that has empires in different forms. There are multinational corporations that exploit people. There are, foreign policy influences.
The United States government, exactly, how is it any different from an empire?
Exactly. They function essentially to the detriment of conquered peoples. They function exactly like pre-modern empires. And we continue to benefit, even those of us who claim to be against imperialism, we continue to benefit. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the cars we drive, we benefit from, the suffering of people who are having these imperialist ambitions imposed on them without their free will. So I think we have to interrogate ourselves and keep that in mind as well, that before we step back and start to judge everyone in history for everything they've done, how do those practices continue today, and how do we allow those practices to continue and benefit from them?
The kind of subtle empire that eludes our kind of gaze now, but we somehow manage to criticize every other empire in history. It's strange, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to look very deep to see the empires that are at play, that the empires who are playing the game of chess in the world at the moment. There's even, like tributaries and puppet rulers that are established nowadays that are exactly the same as what happened throughout history. Exactly the same thing. But I think
just different words, different definitions.
Different words, different definitions, and because we call it something else.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to put fancy meanings to those words in order for us to look as if we're smarter and better.
No, we've progressed.
We've progressed
politically
pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, it's like literally the same ideas as back in those times.
I actually wrote, Hassam, a major essay about the expansion of Islam, and I answered the question about whether Islam was spread by the sword exactly the same as kind of how you mentioned, that understanding of the empire being the kind of political system and empires by their nature expanding. And so I said, if you believe that the empires that did expand in the name of Islam were acting Islamically, then the real question is actually not did the Muslim empires expand, but was the expansion of the Muslim empires the kind of religiously correct way or the religiously correct manner? And more important than that, what did that expansion actually mean? Like you mentioned, the misconception that Muslims were forced to convert. It was even less than Muslims. That non-Muslim populations were not forced to convert. In Umayyad times, I actually read that they didn't like conversions as much, and basically they still levied the jizya, which was the tax for the religious tax, against certain new converts to Islam from Persian and Christian backgrounds. Such was their discouragement of conversions, because the early Umayyad elite didn't really didn't really consider the need for their actual populace to become Muslim. Is that true? How accurate is that?
Well, based on all of the sources I've encountered, that's exactly right. For the Umayyad situation in particular, and much of that earlier, quick expansion of Islam from Spain to China that we're talking about did, occur in the Umayyad period between sort of the 660s and the 750. That century was when most of that expansion occurred. And again, from the sources I've come across and sort of engaged with, it is exactly that the as a matter of policy, they liked to sort of keep the non-Muslim populations as they were and actually actively discourage conversion. And, this was, for one, because it wasn't any kind of this was much easier for the conquered populations to accept, because it almost became a sort of secularized expansion, right? It is just another empire divorced from the worldview that these particular people stand for. Yes, they might believe in it, but they often, the Muslim conquerors, they wouldn't even live in those cities that they conquered. They would have their own little settlements just outside the city, etc. And this is how some of the biggest cities that we know of in the Islamic world, such as Cairo, right, was formed. There was an existing city, and there was a Muslim settlement of the Muslim forces outside that city, and slowly the two of them came together and formed this enormous metropolis in Egypt, right? And so there wasn't that sort of active, and in the early stages, not even da'wah, for example, right? Not even invitation to Islam. So all of this was we have to slow down the pace and look at it. This was an extremely gradual process. The Umayyads in particular, coming back to their policy, they loved the fact that they could extract the jizya. In some cases, it was the jizya, which was the payment required from the non-Muslim population in exchange for protecting them, offering protection to them. And sometimes it wasn't jizya. Sometimes other forms of tribute and other forms of payment and were also established. And for the conquered people, this was often nothing new. The same kind of tributes that they had paid to rulers in the past, and oftentimes much easier on them than what they had paid to would it be the Romans or the Persians or whoever that particular pre-Islamic ruler happened to be. And again, it's just, it's almost, silly to keep saying this, but at the same time, it's just, baffling how often in our discussions we don't keep in mind how complex this movement is. Again, like I mentioned, and that's why I like to mention this previously, one person's decisions are so complicated. Now imagine the decisions of thousands of people as and their interactions and the environment they build and how their environment affects them, etc. So in the Umayyad case as well, there was this particular environment where they were encouraging expansion. They loved the jizya. And it was during the Umayyad time, I think, that the leadership really started to behave like the pre-Islamic sort of rulers, and in a monarchical kind of way, building empire builders and kings, and extracting tribute and expanding their empire for the sake of just having the claim to this enormous land, etc. And when you actually look at it and look at their policies about whether they were trying to convert people to Islam, that wasn't the case at all, and it seems like it almost wasn't a priority for them.
Yeah, I've even heard commentators and historians refer to the Umayyad and even the Abbasid Khulafa as being almost comparable to secular rulers, in the sense that some of them were even nominally Muslim.
I would see lots of examples, yeah.
That they really had no interest in imposing a quote-unquote state religion, and that religion didn't even inform the kind of laws that they often mandated.
What about the Bayt al-Amal? Didn't they have that? Like, wasn't that sort of things like that sort of justify that they were, religiously inclined? If that
some of them were definitely religiously inclined. For example, Umar ibn Abdulaziz. No one can really doubt the piety and genuine faith of Caliph Umar ibn Abdulaziz, but there were 100%. There were caliphs who had very little to do with any kind of religious promotion in terms of the populace. However, I think this is something that's a distinction. There were kind of creations of Islamic culture at the time that were done so not to promote Islam in the society, but to kind of display the prestige and the glory of the rulers themselves.
Right.
Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's absolutely correct. I mean, if we look at, again, the best of examples of Muslim leadership, the Prophet ﷺ, there were no, just look at any of the descriptions of his own mosque during his time, right? Just built of very basic form of sort of raw materials, etc., whatever was locally available. And then you see examples of even when the Islamic Empire had considerably expanded, like during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, you see the example of, for example, the Roman ambassador coming to Medina and finding him just laying sort of in the dirt outside of the masjid, right? So you find all of these examples of their simplicity, not their powerlessness, but not a false sort of management display of humility, but their genuine simplicity, because they were investing their time and energy elsewhere. And oftentimes in what you see in the later kings is you'll see these grand sort of structures that are built to establish their own prestige, and sometimes even the prestige. So sometimes it's a mix of both, such as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, right, by Abdul Malik ibn al-Marwan, who's considered the first empire builder, one of the early Umayyad caliphs. But it does become about, thrones and glittery buildings. And my favorite example from Islamic history is really the Taj Mahal, right? You see this building, which had really, obviously it's making a lot of money for India today and has for a very long time. But considering the fact that there is considerable evidence that it actually, brought down to some extent the economy of the Mughal Empire at the time, complete, waste, and for what, right? And representing what exactly. So there were many examples, I think, where rulers did pursue policies and they did pursue projects that had very little to do with Islam, and really took a heavy influence from what they saw kings and rulers in other parts of the world and those that came before them.
If you are sort of and I'd say this to my audience, if you are sort of a practicing brother or sister and you do want to look into Islamic history and you want a kind of judgment for which you want to, like, a kind of
look into the history.
Standard. No, that's one of it. But if you want a kind of standard through which to understand many of the rulers, look at what the great ulama wrote about many of the governments of the time and the relationship between the ulama and the governments. Abu Hanifa was very critical. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was very, very critical of the Umayyad policy towards non-Arab Muslims. Imam Malik had a very fractured relationship with the government that even culminated in him being tortured. I think at some point 3 out of the 4 imams were locked in jail or tortured by rulers.
Right.
So if you want to understand how these rulers generally operated in relation to the religion itself, all you need to do is look at the relationship between
Said Nursi with the Turkish government.
Yeah.
It's like some next level stuff that he did. Like he got abandoned, he got exiled, and you know the stuff that he wrote in the process, and he got jailed, and like not even just like back in those times, but even the recent times.
Yeah, they were secular rulers too, the Kemalist Ataturks. But the understanding though that what has often happened in the name of the Islamic Empire is very different from what the people who are most knowledgeable in terms of the religion would have preferred, or what they were actually directly calling for. How does the sort of expansion of Islam as an empire compare to other empires directly? For example, people might look, I often used to draw comparisons with the Mongol Empire, which is also a really important example for Muslims, because the Mongols were this kind of scourge of Islam who obviously sacked Baghdad. They killed more Muslims than I think have ever been killed by any other foreign army. A lot of people thought that the Mongols were even Yujan Majuj. It was so dramatic and terrible for the Muslims. I don't think many of us would understand how bad it was. But then they converted to Islam. 3 out of the 4 Mongol armies converted to Islam. But yeah, in terms of the expansion and the influence that Islam was able to have on societies compared to, say, what the Byzantines were able to do, what the Sassanid Persians were able to do, how does it compare?
Well, every, empire can be a unit of study in itself, right? And in sort of within that context, what was going on, and within the time period during which that empire existed, what was going on. I think in terms of military or even non-military, just the spread of an empire's influence, Islam or the Islamic Empire, I think, first of all, we should interrogate that term itself, what we mean by Islamic Empire, because as we were just discussing, many of these empires, while they were led by Muslims and primarily had Muslim populations, as a matter of policy making, and when it comes to some of the officiating, empire business, it wasn't too much inspired by actual Islamic teachings, right? So we have particular empires such as the Umayyads, such as the Abbasids, such as the later on, the Seljuks and the Mamluks, and the Songhay and the Sokoto in West Africa, and the Almovarids in Spain and in many parts of the world, the Mughals in India, etc., right? So we have all of these different empires. Initially, if we're talking about the initial expansion of Islam, and I guess during the Umayyad dynasty, when most of what we now consider the core Muslim lands were, unified, at least nominally, under one leadership, the Umayyad leader who had his seat in Damascus in Syria. I think in terms of the expansion, there really is no comparison, right? There really is no comparison in terms of the expansion itself, of how fast that expansion was. Other than, and again, we're talking about the movement and expansion of the Muslim armies here, and I think the one exception would be the Mongols. The Mongols are the only sort of comparable. The Roman Empire, while we do talk about how enormous it was and how influential it was and how many different parts of the world it touched, we have to look at the scale here. So when the Mongols were just looking at, a few, decades, for most of the expansions in the early Muslim empire, we're just looking at a few decades, right? And the Romans had expanded considerably, but their expansion generally was more drawn out over time. So it took a lot of time for these expansions to, the empire to expand, and then maybe a rebellion, so cave in a little bit, then expand further, etc. But again, in terms of when it comes to cultural influence, then we're looking at a different set of criteria. So in that sense, for example, even the Greeks, the Athenian Empire, right? And we have to remember that the people who introduced democracy were themselves an imperialist people, right? The Athenian Empire, it was a city, but they expanded and they were an empire. They have all the characteristics, right? They were expansionist. They had a huge influence, even though they're, in terms of what they controlled and how far their influence reached, are two different questions. Their influence reached enormously far, but what they controlled was actually not very much. So there's all these different variables we can play around with. Maybe we can come back a bit to the Mongol question in particular. I think the difference was that there's no comparison. Obviously, there's a comparison between the time scale and the sort of area over which the expansion occurred, but I think there's no comparison in the sort of brutality of the Mongol conquest. They were much more, from all of the historical sources, and that's also something worth interrogating, because we paint the Mongols as sort of like these, including in the Muslim community, but many people who are more or less familiar with history in general, like this unparalleled, sometimes like the only people, oftentimes you'll see the Mongols compared to are like the Nazis or something. Like, these are the worst of the worst. Like, how bad could it possibly get, right? But the Muslim conquests were not as disruptive. They were not as destructive. They were not nearly as violent in terms of just the amount of people killed and the amount of infrastructural damage caused as the Mongol conquests were. And I think there is that interesting question, right? And then the Mongol conquests were further, so there was that aspect. The Mongols were much more violent. And the other aspect is that the Mongols, within a few generations, as you mentioned, wherever they had expanded to, they assimilated into the local culture and custom and religion, etc. 3 of the 4 Mongol khanates, as you mentioned, embraced Islam, and in China they embraced Buddhism, etc. So they sort of assimilated locally, and so that's the two distinctions, and that's what makes the early Muslim conquest really exceptional, where the Muslims, yes, they did obviously take on local sort of cultures and things of that sort, but their essence, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the essential values and practices of the people remained intact, as well as not having to be nearly as violent to achieve the same amount of expansion in a very similar time scale. So I think that's what really makes what the early Muslim conquest so exceptional, even when compared to the Mongol conquest.
Is it true that I hear a lot of people say this, but it's like 3/4 of the world's population are descendants of Genghis Khan?
3/4. Is it 3/4? I don't think it's 3/4.
or something like that. Isn't there like a stat like that? I don't know how much truth. It's because my mom's maiden name is Khan, so I'm just thinking, am I a descendant of Genghis Khan as well? I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, I mean, there's brutality. There's a lot of fake Khans out there. I often have a conversation with people, the Pashtun people of northwestern Pakistan and Afghanistan, right? And the name Khan is very common amongst them, and they will have this very aggravated conversation about real Khans and fake Khans, etc. It's pretty funny to be in that conversation, but I don't know the answer to that. You hear different. It's definitely okay. Let me tell you, this is definitely not 3/4. I'm pretty sure. I'm not very familiar with the field of genealogy and whatever science is attached to it, but I'm pretty sure it's not that. And descended from Genghis Khan personally, it's a trope, right? And whenever you encounter all of these tropes that are almost accepted as a fact, we have to be really careful about how we talk about it, even in a casual conversation. It's just, again, it's part of this picture of how horrible the Mongols were and how horrible Genghis Khan personally was. Genghis Khan, as whatever crimes he may have initiated during his leadership, Genghis Khan has a very interesting life story. And if you actually read about his life and read about his interests and try to get a more historical understanding of his personality, he's a very interesting person. He wasn't just some brute from out of nowhere. And I think especially in the Muslim community, we have to recognize this, right? And a lot of what happened to the Muslims during the Mongol conquest, the Muslims have to take their fair share of the blame, not just what they were doing, like centuries before and how they were declining and they weren't prepared for the Mongol conquest, but even the decisions taken on the spot where sometimes you read about it and it's baffling how blind and arrogant could you be to just brush off this threat despite knowing that, the city next door had just been completely ruined and razed by this army, and then they come to your door and you decide to talk up to them and be arrogant and not only get yourself, basically finished, but also the innocent people whose leader you were, who you were sort of representing there, right? So I think, again, my main focus, I think every point it becomes idiotic to end off every sort of point I make with it's more complicated than we want it to seem, including the life of Genghis Khan, the Mongol conquest, and literally any topic, right? So whatever topic people are most interested in it, pick it up, but then make sure you're not just scratching the surface. Try to go a bit deeper and you'll find that there's much more to learn and appreciate there.
Yeah, I think quite simply, as opposed to complex, I think the beheading of the Mongol ambassadors by the Khwarezmid, was it the Khwarezmid emir,
right,
was probably one of the most significant events in Islamic history. It was one of the worst decisions, basically reversing the last 500 years. So basically the Mongol ambassadors came to the Muslim empire and it was quite a friendly kind of invitation, like, oh, hey, we're the Mongols, we're in charge of China now. Yeah,
Hi,
just popping up into your Facebook sup,
Yeah.
Yeah,
in the DMs.
I mean, it was an invitation for trade.
Yeah,
right?
it was,
When
and
you think about
the Khwarezmid,
hindsight is 2020.
it just beheaded him.
Yeah,
and then the Mongols invaded Persia and just completely just destroyed the place, and the civilization there, well, it didn't really recover to, its pre-Mongol glory. And they say that often when we talk about the Islamic Golden Age, a lot of people trace the decline of the Islamic Golden Age to the Mongol invasions, though I don't necessarily agree with that personally, but it's one point that, has been mentioned. But
in terms of just, because we're talking about more about expansions and stuff, I wanted to kind of direct the conversation to sort of the early civil wars in Islam that existed. Right. So these sort of were pivotal, it's very pivotal because even it's the reason why we have sectarian divide, right? The Sunni and Shia divide. And more specifically, I just wanted to hone in on, the events of Ali radiallahu anhu and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So would you be able to, so the narrative, there's one narrative to it, right? So the narrative is that, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was like terrible person and just went against Ali radiallahu anhu, and divisions happened, and that's why I think the Shia's case is right. The Sunni case is more like was taking a step back because Muawiyah radiallahu anhu had his own ijtihad and Ali radiallahu anhu had his own ijtihad, and a lot of the scholars say that you get rewarded for your ijtihad even though if it's from a sincere place, that sort of stuff. But that's more coming from the scholars, right? So those are the opinions of our scholars and we sort of take it on board. But in terms of a historical sort of point of view, would you be able to shed some light on that event in particular? Because it would be interesting to gather thoughts and even how you would come to conclusions, or how scholars would come to conclusions about in regards to what exactly happened. Because I heard the sources aren't the strongest either.
I think that this is probably the most complex of things that you're going to have to answer.
Yeah. Right. But I'd love to, just even scratch the surface would be really good.
Right. So I'll start off with a quick story. I had a professor when I was doing my undergraduate degree. This was an introduction to Islamic history, sort of introductory class. And I had a professor and he was teaching this class and he was a Muslim, right? There's obviously non-Muslims in the class. There's Sunni and Shia Muslims in the class. It's sort of a mix as it is in universities. And he was, because he was discussing early Islamic history, he had to at least do one you know, lecture on this particular topic of this early Islamic history. And
Were there
it's
bombs
funny.
thrown around in the room?
The bomb was not thrown around because it was very introductory, and we'd be surprised. You know, a lot of people. We see these discussions on Twitter and other places, and very heated discussions. And I'll admit to you, when I was I have close Shia friends and grew up together. And when we were young, we used to, like, even as teenagers, like, go back and forth with these very, in hindsight, it's like, that's the biggest waste of my time and so nonsensical, because I didn't know what I was talking about, and neither did he. And yet we were having these heated conversations, right? And we're still good friends, but I think so. The professor at the end of the class and during the class, you could notice, and it was visibly, I was looking around, it was confusing some of the people in the class. He was sweating, right? And it wasn't, this is a climate controlled room and everything like that, but he is sweating. And at the end of the class, when it's done, he's actually wiping his brow and wiping the sweat off his face. And he said, you guys might have noticed, this is not just as a Muslim, regardless of, there's this idea that historians have to be objective, but this word objectivity is so problematic because nobody is ever truly objective. We all have certain values and beliefs and principles that we stand by, regardless of what the information presented to us is, right? We have to try to be fair, but whether we can actually ever really be objective, whether we try or not, is a separate question altogether. And he said, for me, I'm an academic. I taught you from an academic perspective, but this is sacred history. This isn't just history. For me, this is sacred history. And for many of the people in this room, this is sacred history, right? So when we're talking about this particular question, and I think the reason why there's so much heated debate on it and why passions are so high whenever this topic comes up, like you said, it's probably the most difficult question I'll have to ask, discuss in this podcast. It is because it's sacred history for all of the different sort of sides, for lack of a better term, who were involved, right? Now, coming to the actual question from a historical perspective, I think in this case, most historians, whether they are more traditionally trained, like Islamic scholars who specialize in history, like, for example, in Canada here, we have Sheikh Kamal al-Makki, who did a very, I thought it was an incredible series of lectures, nearly, I think, 8 hours of lectures just on this particular topic, on the question that we asked. So we have those scholars, and then obviously the academic historians. Some of them are Muslim, some of them are non-Muslim. So you have these three broad categories. More or less, they all go back to the same sort of sources, right? They'll all go back to the such as Tariq al-Tabari and some of these more recognized and authoritative sources of early Islamic history, right? Like Ibn Kathir's Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, some of these books. And so you'll find that the narrative itself of the events, what event led to what and what happened when, etc., is very similar across the three categories, right? But when it comes to interpretation and explanation, that's when the differences occur, right, between the three groups. So how do this particular event happen? How do you interpret it, right? And obviously for the Islamic scholars, the interpretation focuses on how do you take the relevant lessons, the moral lessons, right? Something you can apply to your own life from this particular situation. So there's obviously an entire topic to go into there, the battle of, starts, I think the precursor to that starts right during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. What was the relationship of the Prophet with these particular people involved, such as Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, such as Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu? What was the particular relationship, as well as the other personalities, such as Ammar ibn Yasir radiallahu anhu, for example? And moving forward, how did, the entire sort of narrative about what happened at immediately after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, and what happened after that during the the Khilafah of Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhum, and Sayyidina Uthman and Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhum, right? It's a very, very broad topic, but we have to trace the history that far back. So when we get to the Khilafah of Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, what has to be established is that we are not in a position, nor should we want to be in a position, to make judgments about people. Right? I think for Muslims, and I'm assuming I'm speaking particularly to a Muslim audience, whether they are Shia, whether they are Sunni, because I have had those heated debates with my friends, as I mentioned. I think what the key thing to keep in mind is that to take the relevant lessons from them, right? Take them from trusted, nuanced scholars. And this is something that each of us has to make our decision about. And we can't claim to be ignorant, right? We can tell when a person is really pushing the narrative. None of us are, that stupid that we will, or at least I hope nobody considers themselves that stupid, because I would assume nobody is, that they're just going to take what somebody tells them, even from the mimbar, and not sort of interrogate it and try to understand it and try to implement it into their own lives. So whether you are Sunni, whether you are Shia, engage with the information that you are being exposed to from the traditional scholars, and work with that, and keep a focus on what lessons you are going to draw. Because for historians, it's a different question about providing clarity, right? And who was right, per se, right? For Muslims, I think it's a slightly different question, because we know that justice has already been served, that Allah's justice, there's no escape from it. So whoever deserved whatever they deserved, Allah will take care of it, right? If that process is not already underway, Allahu A'lam, regardless of the individual we are thinking about here, right? So for us, it's more about the lessons we can draw and how we can apply them. If the only lesson you can draw is that you have to hate a particular group, you have to hate a particular person, you have to spend the rest of your life cursing this person and cursing that person, or only defending this person and only singing praises about this person without actually recognizing that they were a human being, and human beings can make mistakes and we should learn from them, then if those are the only sort of set of things that we can draw from, then the problem isn't in the history, then the problem is in our interpretation. And at that point, I think there's no point for us to go into further questions of what happened, because we are not using that history for the right purpose anyways, right? And oftentimes you'll find historians sometimes jump on that fact. So there's one book I will call out by Leslie Hazelton, a particular historian, where it's written in a very narrative form, right? It's written as like this epic story. And in fact, the subtitle of the book is The Epic Story of the Sunni Shia Split. Anytime a historian sort of uses epic in their title, that should be a sort of alarm bell, because they're jumping off of this idea that people are very passionate. The people who are going to read this on both sides of the debate or multiple sides of the discussion are very passionate about this topic, and they're already coming with passion. So let me try to play with that, pull some strings, make it epic, and write it a particular way. And then this happened, and that happened, and then this unbelievable thing happened. I think we should stay clear of all of that. For that sacred history, rely on your traditional Islamic scholars. Unless you actually want to pursue it academically, that's a different conversation. For the average person, I think that's not really a priority. And if it is a priority, like, please get in touch with me or historians you trust and have that conversation with us. But I feel like for the average Muslim who is just seeking clarity, look at your scholars, look at what other scholars have said, compare, contrast, do your due diligence, and pray to Allah to give you clarity about our sacred history so we can learn the relevant lessons. And then trust that Allah has already established justice in the cases of the people who have already passed away. And we can move forward seeing what is best for our particular context. Whether I'm Shia, whether I'm Sunni, what does the Muslim community as a whole, and what does the world as a whole need need from me today? What are the lessons I can draw from this history that I will apply to that situation? And if there are no sort of positive, inspiring, constructive lessons, then there's really no further conversation, at least from where I stand, to be had in this situation.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's a good starting point for people to understand the kind of approach that we should have to these topics. You mentioned the difference between how there's Western commentators and Western historians, and then there's also Muslim commentators and Muslim historians. And I think that's something that, especially you mentioned specific case of kind of, how would you describe it? Trying to create a fitna almost, or a drama out of Islamic history to portray it as this, this glorious Hollywood film. But I want to ask you about Western historians and their view and their portrayal of Islam. I've done a little bit of work on studying Orientalist readings of Islamic history, particularly, and I wonder what your thoughts were. I mean, we see things written about the Ottomans. For example, a lot is emphasized on their persecution of minorities. We see a lot written in India, in the subcontinent, particularly about emperors like Aurangzeb. And then this goes all the way back throughout Islamic history to, as you mentioned, the Muslim civil wars, and even back further to the caliphs. So do you think that there's a kind of agenda by some Western historians to create these kinds of negative images, to render these negative images of Muslim figures throughout history and Islamic history? Do you think it's a concerted effort? Do you think that why is this the case, I guess? Why have these renderings come out of the West? Do you think that Muslims are kind of trying to paper over the cracks of their own flaws? For example, do you think that the Ottomans were, as a lot of Western scholars claim, particularly harsh and discriminatory? Or is that, just an Orientalist kind of portrayal? And the same goes for Aurangzeb and the kind of point you mentioned before about the epic schism.
Right. So this is a very, very important question. So I'm glad we came to it. I think, again, there's a lot of variation, right? So I think generally historians who are actively involved in a project to sort of display and essentialize Islam and then display it in a very, a narrow sort of minded way. There are certainly historians and people, pseudo historians and people who claim to do that, people who do that, and they make their claim in the fact that they are trained historians, etc. Right. So a good example is Daniel Pipes, right? And I'm not sure if many people in Australia or other parts have heard of Daniel Pipes. He is one of the world's leading Islamophobes. I mean, the things this person publishes are really like atrocious content, and you would wonder why anyone would take him seriously. But if someone were not exposed to what his current politics are and how he speaks about Muslims and the Muslim community and how really ugly his discussions are and his perspective is, and they just went back into the sources, Daniel Pipes, when he initially did his PhD, and he's done up to a PhD in, I believe, Middle Eastern history, he went back, and if you go back enough into the 1980s and you just encounter his academic work, you would take him seriously as a historian, right? Because, and I will admit, I have read that work, and it is good historical research that he did about Islamic history. But and so, for example, the same goes for Bernard Lewis, who's very famous historian and obviously had some very essentializing Orientalist views. And later in his life, he did come on the media and say things trying to justify the Iraq war, etc. And he used his position as an academic to involve himself in that discussion and then say those particularly, very nasty things. But at the same time, can we completely ignore his research? I think he made enormous contributions as a researcher to different topics in Islamic history, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, if someone were to not realize the particular perspective, the particular ideology within which the person is producing their research, then, and if they just look at the research, that person, that historian, can then use the fact that people have that approach and then exploit it and do things like just try to justify the Iraq War, right? But on a very broader level, I think for a long time, and this question comes back to what we said a bit earlier about objectivity, about can you truly be objective? As a historian, can you really just stay true to the facts and not insert and not influence and shape whatever work you are producing, whatever research you're producing, through your own particular biases and your own inclinations and your own experiences, right? And I think, like we said earlier, there is no such achievable goal as objectivity. You can try to be fair, you can try to present multiple sides of the argument, and then give your own sort of recommendation about which argument seems to be most reasonable and most accurate. But the claim that I am representing history as it happened, I am true to the facts, these kind of things you can't really claim to do, right? So I think for a long time in the Eurocentric context, so I'm talking about Europe and I'm talking about North America and Australia and some of the other places that were colonized by Europeans, which is many places. So this also includes many universities in parts of what we refer to as the Islamic world, where professors and others do have these Orientalist perspectives. But this essentializing of Islam, this fear of Islam, this ignorance and the fear attached to it about what Muslims are, they are exotic, they are different, they are special. It's essentially dehumanizing, right? Not recognizing Muslims as Muslims are human like everyone else with a particular worldview. So they are just like Christians, they are just like Jews and Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs and shamanists and everything else, right? But essentializing Muslims in particular, and also some of the other peoples in the East, such as the Hindus. The Hindus also get a lot of, Orientalist commentary about them, right? And many other groups do as well. This has, for a long time, over centuries, it has just developed as a sort of cultural environment within which these scholars are born, within which they grow up, the books they read when they initially start learning, right? The language that they're taught to use in universities, etc. So it just becomes a cycle that goes on and on. One generation of professors teaches the next generation of professors. So for example, even the university I go to, University of Toronto, they have departments of history of Near and Middle Eastern civilizations. It's recognized as one of the leading universities in North America for anybody who wants to learn about Islam or Islamic history or the Middle East. And I have professors who are Muslim and they have gone into the academy, right? They are teaching at this university, and they are telling us, their class, about how difficult it is to shift away, even when over lunch meetings, casual conversations, how difficult it is, because at the end of the day, who are the senior professors, who are the agenda setters, who are the gatekeepers of these history departments, of these Islamic studies departments? Generally, they are old white men who are awfully privileged, and they inherited their positions from other old white privileged men. And it's the same perspective that nobody challenges, because they're all coming from a particular background and with particular similar experiences to each other. Now, that being said, I'll say two more things. First thing is that I think we should still, those of us who are trying to shift away and step away from that essentializing Orientalist perspective, we should still make an effort to engage with the research. We can't toss the baby out with the bathwater, as the expression goes, right? You still want to engage with the research. You still want to take whatever is beneficial and useful from it. You don't want to inherit the perspective. So what that means is, when you're doing the engaging, you just have to be extremely careful. Why is this person using this particular word, this particular language? How have they structured their paper or structured their book? Who are they acknowledging, right? What sources are here? What sources are missing? So it's a lot more work, but I think we can still draw a great deal of benefit from the work, even of people who are coming from an Orientalist perspective. And secondly, I think the bottom line is of this entire discussion is that Muslims themselves have to, first of all, make sure they're not just first of all, they have to make sure that and they are thinking critically enough to not absorb this Orientalist perspective themselves, and then they have to also go into the academy, right? So there is my Muslim professor at the University of Toronto. He is in that space. He is recognized. He has done a lot of work to get to a certain position, and from there, he's able to challenge more effectively than all of us who are sitting at a distance, right? And the same goes for like when we blame the media, when we blame, the same goes for the academy, for academics, right? For academia, you have to get involved in the process and make sure that in the process of getting involved, you don't lose sight of your own perspective and just end up, swallowing whatever is spoon-fed, but push back from within. And we have to join the academy. And for those who are committed to that, I think there needs to be support networks from the broader Muslim community. This is something we should encourage as a community for the sake of preserving our identity, because these are the kind of tropes, these are the kind of narratives. If you go back to the raw material of what informs Islamophobia, which is why I joined Yaqeen Institute, because they want to respond to this through research, through academic production, which is why I wrote the papers, right? And I do research, is because we have to respond to Islamophobia, and that Islamophobia causes real threats. Muslims face real threats. There is violence, right? There are wars that are started. There's horrific damage that is done, and it significant part of that does lead back to these Orientalist perspectives and tropes, and we have to do whatever is necessary to challenge those within that space itself.
I think, yeah, just to sum it up, I agree with everything you said. I think it's, if anyone talking in a historical sense starts a sentence with Muslims did, Islam did, with very few exceptions, I'd shut my brain off at that point, because Muslims have often been in a great deal of disagreement as to what the kind of political ventures they ought to be pursuing. And the idea that there's a monolith in Islamic history is honestly one of the most absurd ideas, at least politically I'm talking, not religiously. But the idea that we all have the same kind of political ends, that the Muslim empires were somehow one, united force. I mean, these are just, and you see this language from trained academics, and you think, how did they get there?
Absolutely.
It's like, similar to, like, for example, I know the topic's a bit, controversial in an Islamic perspective, but, feminism, like, people talk about feminism like it's a monolith, but if you delve a bit deeper, there's black feminists that actually hate the white middle-class feminists, and it's like, they're like on the opposite spectrums, but they call themselves feminists. So it's like, who are you going to?
You can't just say feminism is XYZ. It's with anything. You can't say Muslims are XYZ, and like you've been saying, everything is more complex than it seems, and you're dealing with human beings, and we can't even explain our own actions half the time, and you're here trying to explain entire, like, millions or even billions of people and their collective psychology.
I do have a question in that, though, because when the Orientalists look at Muslim sources and sort of, break it down and write their own papers and whatnot, the issue that's really weird is that, for example, we'll hone in on the Sirah. The Sirah, we know that most of the material content that's written is by Ibn Ishaq, and who pretty much Ibn Hisham made it into a more concise version, so everyone can sort of have access to it. But those are literally the only two sources that we have. I think, like, we don't have Ibn Ishaq, but we have pretty much Ibn Hisham. And then you have the Orientalists that kind of get to radical views, like very different views to the Orthodox Muslim views that we have in the tradition, right? So when the Orientalists look at our work, they get like totally different views, but the thing is, they're looking at the same sources as us. And even if you look at the Western academics in the Western institutions, they're not going to open, Ibn Hisham's work and stuff. They're going to, open up Montgomery Watt or people like that,
Right.
if that makes sense. So it's a bit weird, isn't it? Like, I find it a bit dishonest, because it's like trying to say that these Western academics did all the work. They were looking at things objectively because, you know, they're Western and they're not gonna have, you know, sympathy with the religion or the tradition, but they don't point out the fact that they have to, by default, look at the primary source text, which is, you know, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham.
Right.
So that's what I'm a bit confused about, but I would like to get your thoughts about this whole idea.
Just before that, I actually did a paper on Patricia Crone's biography of the Prophet, or like her discussion.
Right.
Yeah, I actually did a paper on that, and I think one of the things that I was confused about, it's the same. She actually addresses Ibn Ishaq, and she addresses that as a weak kind of rendering of the seerah. But one thing that she didn't do, I don't know about that. Personally, I don't know. Maybe you'd be able to shed some light on that. But for me personally, it was the fact that she discredited all hadith scholarship ever, without acknowledging the fact that Muslims themselves have quite rigorous and, I think, very interesting ways of rendering kind of Islamic, like the seerah and the authenticity of these things. It's not like we just it's not like we just have said everything is sahih. Anything that could be a hadith, we're just going to chuck it in the collection. Yeah, sure, perhaps there are a couple of hadith that we classified as sahih that aren't. It's very possible. But to say that Muslims, every single hadith in our corpus is pretty much a fabrication, to me is just one of the most, it's an absurd claim by Orientalist scholars.
Yeah. So we'd like to get your thoughts on that, just everything we've said. I don't know if it's a question, but a lot to unpack
I think it's definitely a bit disingenuous, I think is the word, what a lot of these scholars turn up being when they're involved in these kind of projects. When it comes to the question of sources in particular, I believe there is a shift, right? So the profession of history, just tracing the history of the profession itself really is only about, like you could say 130, 140 years old, when history, the historians were referring to, I should say, their tradition that they follow, which is this tradition that emerged in Europe in the mid-19th century. That is what they say when history became professionalized. And it's went through several stages since then. But since the 1960s and the time afterwards, there has been a sort of literary turn, right? And there's always been this bias towards the written, right? And contemporary written, especially written at the time of the event that is being described, right? But at the same time, I think in recent years, very recently, once again, there is a shift. There is a shift from that, from the literary turn, from that emphasis on the literature to, again, broadening the sources of history, right? So Patricia Crone is a bit of a dated example. If you look at some of the more recent works, scholars will still have to address this question in their introductions about why they use hadith sources to inform their work, etc., why they went into those sources, despite previous scholars, for example Patricia Crone, did not want to engage with these sources. And the reason, and I think it's a very reasonable conclusion that I just took them very long to arrive at, is, well, even if it's a very important question, that even if let's suppose that these particular sources are not completely reliable or accurate. These hadith books, these arguments that the hadith books were compiled like 300 years after the Prophet ﷺ, and many of the seerah books were also compiled at least a few decades right after him, etc. So how can we rely on these books? There are all these arguments, but one thing that's come up, which I think is very interesting, I don't know how it will play out in the long run, is the fact that some scholars argue that even if these historical sources aren't historically completely accurate. The fact that they inform the decisions and the lives of more than 1.5 billion of the world's people mean that we should still look at them and interrogate them and try to shape our research around them, and at the very least not toss them completely out the window, right? So that's one perspective. And then the other perspective is that we can just use these original sources, sort of broaden out our research, so we can, just broaden the research so you have access to more resources, right? And then you can draw upon multiple sources of information and try to piece together. You can't claim it's 100% accurate, but then again, nobody ever can, even if somebody were to write a book about something that happened a week ago, right, in February 2019, no historian could make a claim that their perspective, what the information they're presenting, is 100% accurate and reliable, because how do you know? Right? How can you have possibly interrogated every single source of information that is available? And you might not even know there are other sources of information that are also available, but you don't even know about them. So that's last week. I mean, forget about 1400 years ago, right? So there are these, the fact that had become an established fact, that we can't rely on seerah books, can't rely on hadiths, etc., can't rely on the authenticity of any of these things, has slowly been challenged because people are still interested in the fact that there are so many Muslims, and Islam is such a powerful force both in the present world as well as throughout history. How can we possibly just completely ignore the original sources that these people turn back to and that these people use as a reference point? We can't just completely ignore them, right? We have to engage with them in some way. Now, coming to that realization that they had to engage with them in some way, it has broadened the horizons a bit. And then as well as, emphasis on the histories of other people. So apart from Islamic history, for example, pre-modern African history was often the same, because these are oral cultures, oral societies. They pass down their knowledge, their traditions, their history orally, through their generations, many of them, right? Again, I don't mean to essentialize here, but it is, quite common in many African societies that this is the way things are done. Does that mean that all of pre-modern African history should be ignored because we don't have the written sources that were contemporary to the events that they described? Well, yes, you could say that, but then what are you? Then the field is closed. Then the discussion is over, right? And the scholars do want to keep up the discussion, so they have to eventually tap into these things. And oral history, non-literary sources, increasingly, just in recent years, when I went to university and studied history, we had some of these discussions, and the field of vision about what we can rely on as a source is definitely broadening, and how it plays out in the long term with effect on the field of Islamic history, time will tell.
Oh, mashallah. Yeah, that's interesting perspective about the whole fact that people the scholars have to look at the primary source text, because it dictates most of how Muslims live in the current day and age. It's like divinity sort of playing out. Like, it's something you can't shake off the divine.
If you want to understand Islam and Muslims' actions, you have to understand the hadith, whether you consider it historically valid or not. It's essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and I think their definition kind of becomes narrow, because they're trying to define it in a way where you can kind of shake off the fact that the hadith literature isn't valid.
It's very interesting though, and I think you can just agree with this, or maybe not, but most contemporary scholars don't disagree with. They actually say that the Quran is the most authentic source on the history of early Islam. That there are very few, even revisionist Orientalists, criticize the authenticity of the Quran.
I think there was like the top copy one they try to refute.
They found manuscripts in Yemen, they carbon dated to around 650, 640, so they can't really criticize the Quran. And even, I remember Patricia Crone saying that the most authentic source on early Islam was actually the Quran. And it's only really like Christian apologists who raise the point that the Quran is not sahih, like authentic. So that's interesting that that they see. They just say that you can't really understand the Quran. Like the Quran can't be
Right.
understood, though the verses of it are actually preserved.
Right. It's a very broad discussion, and many things I think are changing currently. You know, the whole circulation of, and this is beyond Islam and beyond history, and just in general what we see around us, what we rely on as sources of information. You know, everything. I think something to keep in mind is how interrelated the things we encounter on a day-to-day basis. At the end of the day, it's all still the flow of information, where information comes from, how it is processed, where it ends up, what is the feedback loop, etc. So when it comes to such things as fake news, as digital media technologies, as, you know, like for example this podcast that we're on right now, to future historians 100 years down the road, is this an authentic source of and of whatever, is it a good reflection of what's happening in the world around us today, about what is the state of the field of Islamic history in the year 2019, etc. So I think there's a lot more questioning and broadening again of what is history and how we approach it and engage with it and learn from it, right? Just the flow of information. So it's a very interesting time to sort of step back and try to pay attention and see how things play out and change over the long term, because I'm very hopeful that there will be a lot of change, certainly, and hopefully for the better, I should say, because you never know, it could get worse as well.
SubhanAllah, I think we might have to wrap up soon, but because Rafael is going to slave away to the capitalist system soon, so
Okay.
before we
That's his way of saying I'm going to work.
Yeah, as shall we all, right?
SubhanAllah, but we usually ask this question to when we do remember, to all our guests, and I think it's my favorite question, to be honest, and I gain traction online as well. People love the question, but it will be interesting to get your thoughts, because you're the historian. So if there were 3 people in history that you wanted to chill with in a cave, because boys in the cave, who would they be? It could be anyone. It can be non-Muslim. Oh yeah. It's a few rules. No prophets, because everyone's gonna pick prophets, and the Sahaba. We'll just assume they're already there, so we don't. It's not disrespectful, but you can pick like 3 other people in history.
Well, you asking me because I'm a historian, you might think it might make it easier, but it actually makes it enormously difficult, right? Just being aware of all these people that I would love to meet. And I always joke with my friends, I'm like, I hope most of the interesting people in history make it to Jannah, and so do I, so we can all have, the discussions that I'd love to have with them. And if I had to pick 3, I would definitely Salahuddin would definitely be one of them. I think Ibn Khaldun would be one of them, and who would be the third one? Probably I'm gonna say like Ibn Rushd, for example. And this is like one of those, in the Hall of Fame speech when they thank everyone, and then they say, "Whoever I forgot to thank, you're really appreciated." It's like one of those moments. It's like, I'm sorry to whoever figure I just can't think of them right now, right? So
Yeah, if inshallah you get to Jannah, they're going to be waiting there with their arms folded, like you read so many of my books, and yet you couldn't think of me.
Inshallah. And I think one more thing that I think just to say in closing is that everything we discuss in podcasts, I'm hoping it's assumed, but it's food for thought, right? And I'd love feedback. If there's a way you guys can communicate any feedback that comes in back to me, and I'd love to further any of the topics, any of the questions we discuss. We could discuss so much more. So hopefully this opens up more conversations, and definitely it's whatever we say is not the authoritative or final say on anything.
Yeah, that's why we started the podcast, just to get the ideas out there, because it kind of makes people think we sort of fed at times maybe one narrative when it comes to certain subject matters, but we do want to expand your brain cells a bit and get different ideas and thoughts and find new arguments and better arguments and get exposed to the right people. So I think that's what you did as well. We asked you, we went like all around the shop, but I think people gained a lot of insights into different subject matters, history, Quran, Islam, history of Islam specifically. And it's about making people aware about those ideas and concepts that exist, and we should be proud of our deen because we embody it, but at the same time not just on a ritualistic sense but also on a proper academic discourse sort of sense. But regardless, JazakAllah Khayr, Hassam, for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed it as well.
I really did. Thank you guys. JazakAllah Khairan to you as well. And I hope it does spark some more interesting, informative conversations, inshallah.
Inshallah. And if people wanted to check out your stuff, where can they visit you? Not your address, but like I'm talking. But yeah, your social medias or.
If someone is that willing to put in that effort, I'm perfectly happy to accommodate. But I do live in very
address
far
in
away
the show
Canada,
notes, inshallah.
right? I live in Canada, so we're in the middle of nowhere. But I think the best place online is probably my blog. So www.ihistory.co, not .com, just .co, which is the best way to sort of reach me with emails and also just check out some of the work that I've done.
Okay, mashAllah. So I'll put the links. I'll put your social media as well because I know you use Twitter as well. So I'll put all those links, inshallah. So from our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook. And you can follow our journey through Instagram. We're available on Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, you name it, podcast, Pocket Cast. If you have Android, there's different podcast apps you can use. So we're on YouTube as well, iTunes. We're on pretty much everything. So definitely, if you want to listen to us on different platforms, you definitely can. And you can also leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes. That greatly helps us. And you can support us on Patreon. Alhamdulillah, we've improved a lot of our production and we actually have huge plans in the makings. We're doing bit by bit, but we actually got some big ideas coming up and we want to put it into action, and we can only do it through your support, inshallah. So check out patreon.com/boysinthecave. And so from our special guests, Hassam, Rafael and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalam Walaykum.